Syncopation in music is when offbeats get stressed. This happens a lot in jazz, and one of my favorite examples is Scott Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag. If you listen to it, you'll probably notice that you've heard it before, even if perhaps you didn't know the name of the piece. And in one of the many overlaps between speech and music, we actually have something similar in historical linguistics, something we call syncope. And syncope refers to the loss of unstressed consonants, vowels, and sometimes entire syllables as languages change over time. It's a diachronic phenomenon. And if you know this channel, you know that what we're going to be looking at today is the consonants, vowels, and syllables Romance lost in the transition between late Latin and modern Romance. Now, of course, as always, the disclaimer here is that I'll be looking at the 4 Romance languages I'm most comfortable with. I do hope in time to be able to add others to this comparison, but we will get there. That's a work in progress. So I want you to look at the following patterns. If we look at unstressed vowels preceding or following the rhotic consonant r in Latin, we notice something interesting. The Latin aperire, to mean open, becomes abrir in Spanish, abrir in Portuguese, ouvrir in French, and aprire in Italian. Once again, apologize for any bad Portuguese pronunciation. You can correct me down in the comments below. Humerum, which refer to this thing here in Latin, you'll know in Spanish is ombro. In Portuguese, ombro. In a previous video, we even looked at how the Latin litera is letra in Spanish, letra in Portuguese, lettera in Italian, and lettre in French. What we've noticed so far is the disappearance of the vowels in this particular case, but sometimes Italian turns out to be a little bit more conservative. This is another good example. Operam in Latin is obra in Spanish, obra in Portuguese, ouvre in French, but it remains opera in modern Italian. Honorare, to honor in Latin, that O disappears in Spanish, honrar, Portuguese honrar, but it does remain in the French honorer and in Italian onorare. The Latin eremum, referring to an uncultivated field, is yermo in Spanish and ermo in Portuguese. In French, it's an erme, and in Italian today, it's an ermo. Viridem or viridem is verde in Spanish, virt in Portuguese, vert in French, and verde in Italian. But now, let's move to the examples where the vowel finds itself between the consonant, the lateral alveolar proximant l. The Latin fabulam is actually where we get the Spanish habla, which is in the verb hablar, and the Portuguese fala. Insulam, referring to an island in Latin, is isla in Spanish, and ilia in Portuguese. French has il, and Italian has isola. Once again, we see Italian being a little bit less prone to syncope. And one of the really interesting examples here is how populum in Latin, meaning the populace, the people, is pueblo in Spanish. We can see it's already lost that o. In Portuguese, it's povo. In French, peuple. But Italian, again, proves itself slightly more conservative with popolo. The Latin solitarium, to mean alone, does have solitario in Spanish, but that solitario is actually a later reintroduction. The more common form is soltero, as you will know, and solteiro in Portuguese. So much for syncope between R's and L's in Romance. There's another interesting example, and that's when the syncope finds itself between the sibilant s and the voiceless plosive t. For this, we can look at how Latin positum becomes Spanish puesto, Portuguese posto, French poste, and Italian posto, all examples of syncope. Then we have how the Latin consuturam becomes costura in Spanish, costura in Portuguese, couture in French, and still costura in Italian. Now, I had to unfortunately read off a list there because I couldn't remember every single example off my head. But this raises a question. Why is syncope so widespread in these Romance languages? The fact that it seems almost a universal norm indicates that it was probably widespread in late Latin. So we can date these changes towards the beginning of the Middle Ages, I think, fairly safely. Maybe I'm jumping ahead of the gun there. Let me know in the comments below if that's the case. But I always like to leave a hypothesis here, and my thinking here is that this might actually have to do with the fact that Latin has phonemic vowel length. We've spoken about this a little bit before, but it seems to me intuitive that if you have a language that has quite a sharp distinction between the long and the short vowels, those short vowels are going to be slightly more vulnerable to change. And indeed, if we actually look at the examples we've looked at here, almost all of them, if I'm not mistaken, are actually examples of syncope, disappearance of short, unstressed vowels. I don't think that's a coincidence. I actually have a strong feeling that phonemic vowel length in Latin is the cause of this widespread syncope, at least in Western Romance. Maybe it even extends to Romanian. You can let me know if you speak Romanian down in the comments. I'd be interested to hear that. But I should also, before leaving off, mention that this is in fact just one part of a two-part series, because though syncope affects all the Western Romance languages, as far as I can tell, certainly the four major ones, it seems to be extreme in Iberian Romance. And for example, Portuguese and Spanish have secondary instances of syncope, and in Spanish it even comes across as relatively controlled. I want to give you some interesting examples here. Notice how the adjective bona in Latin becomes buena in Spanish, but boa in Portuguese. Portuguese seems to take this tendency, this pattern, to the extreme. Portuguese, it's not enough to say bienvenidos as we would in Spanish, it's bem-vindo. And that's what I want to look at in the next video. I know I've already promised follow-up videos for previous interesting topics that I haven't delivered on yet, but we will get there in time. Thank you very much for your patience, and thanking you for watching this video. I hope to see you in the follow-up video and in the next video we release. For now, I will say tante grazie, muchas gracias, obrigado, and merci.